What kind of man doesn't even own a car? The taxi driver sneered, shaking his head. Bet you've never paid a bill in your life, huh, Padre? But what he didn't realize was that the quiet, soaking wet passenger in the back seat was Pope Francis himself, and by the time the ride was over, everything the driver thought he knew about value, pride, and presence had changed. Before we reveal what happened next, hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The rain fell like whispered prayers that morning in Rome, gentle, persistent, washing the ancient city clean. Steam rose from espresso cups on cafe patios. Puddles mirrored centuries-old architecture in perfect, rippling reflections. The city smelled of wet stone and coffee and time. Church bells echoed across the Tiber, their bronze voices calling faithful and tourist alike to acknowledge the hour. Vendors unfurled awnings with practiced movements, protecting their wares from heaven's gentle weeping. Somewhere, a street musician tested violin strings under the shelter of a medieval archway, the notes hanging in the moist air like forgotten ghosts. Rome in the rain was different than Rome in sunshine, quieter, more contemplative. The city revealed itself in layers, ancient stone darkened by moisture, revealing textures and patterns invisible in harsh light. Even the tourists moved differently, less hurried, more willing to pause under awnings and actually see what stood before them, rather than merely photograph it. In this delicate ballet of tourists and locals stood a man who wasn't in any rush at all, just a simple figure near the edge of a narrow piazza, white robes clinging slightly to his sides in the damp air. A small black satchel hung over one shoulder. A modest silver cross rested against his chest. Nothing about him demanded attention, and yet he had a stillness about him that seemed to part the chaos, like a rock in a rushing stream. He stood with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that waiting wasn't wasted time. His hands, weathered, with prominent veins tracing routes like ancient Roman roads, were clasped loosely before him. Not in prayer exactly, but in the comfortable posture of a man accustomed to observing the world without needing to impose himself upon it. A young mother hurried past, struggling with a stroller and an umbrella that refused to cooperate. Without hesitation, the man in white stepped forward, steadying the umbrella with one hand while she adjusted her grip. She thanked him with a distracted smile, not really seeing him, then continued on her way. He watched her go with gentle eyes that held neither expectation of gratitude nor disappointment at its absence. Luca Moretti spotted him through the rhythmic sweep of his taxi's wipers. Late 40s, permanent lines etched around his eyes, not from laughter, but from squinting at traffic for 20 years. He slowed his Fiat just enough to roll down the passenger window, raindrops immediately speckling the interior. "Need a ride, Padre?" he called out, one hand still on the wheel. The man smiled, not the practiced smile of someone used to performing kindness, but the genuine warmth of someone who recognized another human being. "If it's not too much trouble," he replied, voice steady and unrushed. Luca waved him in with calloused fingers. "Trouble's my business." The words came with a half-smirk, the kind that suggested both cynicism and a grudging willingness to help anyway. His passenger settled into the back seat quietly. No fumbling, no unnecessary movements. Just presence. Rain tapped against the windows in an irregular heartbeat as the car pulled away from the curb. Luca gave the rearview mirror a quick glance, just enough to catch his passenger's eyes, which didn't look away or down, like most people's did when caught in a glance. They just met his, calm and attentive. 30 years of driving had taught Luca to read people in those first few seconds. Businessmen who wanted silence, tourists who craved local secrets, couples who pretended not to be fighting. But this passenger? He couldn't quite place him. There was something both ordinary and extraordinary about those eyes. Dark, expressive, but with a depth that made Luca oddly self-conscious, as if they could see past the practiced indifference he wore like a uniform. "Where to?" Luca asked, already turning toward the center, just across the river, near the Vatican. Luca couldn't help the smirk that tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Of course. Figures." He adjusted the mirror slightly, allowing himself another look at his passenger. "Priest, right?" The man nodded, the movement almost imperceptible. "Yes, of a sort." "No offense," Luca added, merging into traffic with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every pothole and blind corner in the Eternal City. "But what kind of priest doesn't own a car in this city? I mean, it's the 21st century. Even my mother has a Vespa, and she's terrified of them." He swerved around a delivery truck that had double-parked, earning a half-hearted gesture from its driver, part apology, part futile protest. This was the language of Rome's streets, a fluid negotiation carried out in honks, hand signals, and the occasional colorful phrase that somehow never quite crossed into true anger. The priest smiled, not defensively, not with embarrassment. Just a gentle curve of lips that suggested he'd heard this question before and wasn't bothered by it. "I find it easier to listen when I'm not the one behind the wheel." He shifted slightly, the seat leather creaking beneath him. "When you drive, you must focus on the road, the other cars, the pedestrians stepping out without looking. But as a passenger—" He gestured toward the window, where an elderly couple walked arm in arm under a shared umbrella. "I can see that those two have been married 50 years. I can notice the boy on the corner saving half his sandwich for the stray cat watching from the alley. Small things. But are they really small?" Luca chuckled, a sound that started in his chest and ended somewhere between amusement and dismissal. "Yeah, well, most people don't ride in this thing to be heard. They ride to get somewhere fast." He punctuated the last word with a short horn tap at a pedestrian who'd stepped into the crosswalk too early. Another red light. Another puddle splashed across the hood like a painter's broad stroke. Luca drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. A restless rhythm that matched the city's pulse. "I just don't get it," he said, the words tumbling out before he'd fully decided to speak them. "No phone, no car, no assistant. How do you survive in a city like this?" The answer came with a simplicity that felt almost frustrating. "I manage." "Well, must be nice to have someone else worry about the bills," Luca said, accelerating through an amber light. "Some of us don't have that luxury." "I do worry," the priest said with a gentleness that somehow didn't feel condescending. "Just not about the same kind," Luca snorted, a sound that carried decades of Roman skepticism. "You clergy types always got a clever line, like those little quotes on church signs. Bet you haven't filled a gas tank in years." The priest didn't answer. He just looked out the window, watching the city pass by with an attention that suggested he was seeing individual people, not just a blur of movement. Luca didn't notice the subtle shift in tone, the way the priest's silence began doing the heavy lifting in their conversation, the way it created space without emptiness. He just shook his head, pushing against a quiet he wasn't comfortable with. "People like you really think walking is holy or something?" "No," the man said softly, "but it keeps me grounded." The taxi turned off the main thoroughfare and cut through a residential stretch the Rome tourists never bothered to find. Shuttered cafes with handwritten menus, water-streaked windows with geraniums stubbornly blooming on the sills, laundry strung between buildings like colorful bridges. Luca kept one hand on the wheel, the other gesturing wildly as he spoke, as if trying to conduct an invisible orchestra. "I'll tell you what I don't understand," he began, turning down the radio that had been mumbling soccer scores. "You got these bishops in gold robes, popes with marble statues and private guards, and they still tell regular folks to live simple." The words didn't come with venom, just the weary frustration of someone who'd given up expecting consistency from the world. You ever see the Vatican from inside? I dropped off a diplomat last year. Place has more gold than a casino in Monaco. The man in the back gave no response, only the occasional nod, not dismissive, attentive like someone weighing each word. It didn't deter Luca, who had found an unexpected audience for thoughts he usually kept to himself. I mean, come on, he continued, taking a sharp right at a fountain where three elderly men sat playing cards, oblivious to the damp. They preach humility, then hide behind bulletproof glass. They bless the poor, sure, but from balconies. You ever seen one of them eat at a soup kitchen, roll up their sleeves in a shelter? I haven't. Yes, the passenger said quietly, the single word dropped like a pebble in still water. Luca blinked, glancing back. What? I've seen it. More than once. Huh. Luca caught the priest's gaze in the rear view again, his own eyes narrowing slightly. You're not like most I've driven. Most priests try to shut me up by now. I don't believe silence helps anyone feel heard. Luca laughed, a genuine sound this time, rough around the edges, but real. Maybe you should run for office. The rain had started again, lighter this time, more like a mist brushing the windshield than a downpour. Pedestrians no longer darted. For cover, just tilted their faces slightly away from the moisture. Luca rolled his shoulders and leaned back, stretching the stiffness from his neck. 20 years behind the wheel had left knots no massage could fully untangle. Truth is, he said, voice dropping to something closer to confession than conversation. I used to believe, really. Grew up with Mass every Sunday, rosary at Grandma's, the whole thing. But then life happened. He tapped the brake at another red light, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. My brother lost his job at the factory, 3 kids, mortgage, church couldn't help. My cousin got denied help when her husband walked out. Something about paperwork not being in order. They talk about mercy, but when you actually need something, forms, committees, waiting lines. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, a nervous habit he'd picked up as a boy, sitting in church pews. That felt too hard, too still. You know what my grandmother used to say? God doesn't abandon us, people do. She believed that until the day she died. Cancer took her slow, painful. I was there when the parish priest told her suffering was a gift. His laugh was bitter, sharp against the gentle patter of rain. Some gift. The windshield was beginning to fog slightly at the edges. Luca adjusted the defroster with practiced precision. The sound of warm air filled the silence between them. I still have her rosary. You know, in my nightstand. Can't seem to throw it away. He hadn't meant to say that part out loud. He hadn't admitted that to anyone, not even his wife. Why was he telling this stranger? The man behind him tilted his head slightly, a gesture almost lost in the shadows of the back seat. I'm sorry to hear that. Simple words, no platitudes about divine plans or God's mysterious ways, just recognition of pain heard. Luca shrugged, a jerky motion that tried to shed the weight of old disappointments. Eh? We all move on, don't we? Some of us just don't have the luxury of faith anymore. He expected an argument, a parable, something about keeping the faith or God's mysterious ways, but the man just said, that's not a luxury, that's a wound. That one hit harder than Luca would ever admit, like someone touching a bruise he'd forgotten was there. He changed the subject with the abruptness of someone stepping away from an edge. So what's a guy like you doing out in the rain this early? No car, no driver? I was visiting a family near Trastevere, the priest replied, his gaze drifting momentarily to the passing streets. They lost someone recently. Luca glanced at him through the mirror, catching something in the man's expression, a shadow of genuine sorrow, not the professional sympathy he'd expected. You always travel this light? It keeps me from confusing weight with worth. For a moment the cab went silent, just the sound of tires over wet pavement and Rome's quiet morning hum filtering through the glass. Then Luca chuckled, the sound softer than before. You got answers for everything, huh? only the ones people are already asking. Luca couldn't put his finger on it, but something about this man made the air feel different. Not heavy, just still, like standing in the eye of a storm you didn't know was raging until it paused. He took a turn toward the river, the city's old bones stretching out ahead, domes and spires touched with morning light that somehow cut through the clouds. The passenger didn't check his phone, didn't fidget, didn't glance anxiously at his watch, just sat with the same peacefulness that was starting to unnerve Luca more than any sermon could. "Mind if we stop somewhere for a quick coffee?" the passenger asked as they reached a red light near an old cobblestone alleyway that looked like it hadn't changed since Caesar's time. Luca raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "Sure, long as you're buying." The priest smiled, a warmth in it that felt earned rather than practiced. Of course. They pulled up outside a tucked-away cafe, one of those local joints that tourists stumble upon once and spend the rest of their lives trying to find again. No neon signs, no trendy music floating from hidden speakers, just a wooden door, a hand-painted window with chipped lettering, and the smell of real espresso drifting out through the seams. Luca killed the engine. "You sure this place is even open?" The priest was already stepping out, seemingly unbothered by the light rain still falling. "It's always open." Inside, the cafe felt suspended in time. Two old men sat in the corner playing cards, their faces maps of Rome's history etched in wrinkles and character. They played in comfortable silence, occasionally murmuring scores or gentle insults that had lost their sting decades ago. One wore a flat cap that might have been fashionable when Mussolini was still in power. The other's cardigan had patches on the elbows, lovingly mended by hands that had probably left this world years ago. A young woman wiped tables with the sort of tired care that said she'd been up before sunrise. Her movements were efficient, but graceful, the unconscious choreography of someone who'd performed these actions thousands of times. Around her wrist, a string of blue beads caught the light when she reached for a forgotten spoon. The walls were painted a warm ochre that had softened over the years like well-loved leather. Black and white photographs hung in mismatched frames. Faces from the past, watching over the present with sepia smiles. A small television in the corner played a morning news program, with the volume turned so low it was practically a mime show. The barista behind the counter, beard just beginning to grey at the edges, apron worn to a perfect softness, looked up as the bell above the door announced their arrival. His hands were moving automatically, muscle memory guiding them through the ritual of preparing the day's first batch of biscotti. The scent of almonds and anise filled the air, mingling with the rich embrace of coffee. And then he froze, the rolling pin in his hands stilled mid-motion. A thin cloud of flour hung suspended between them like a question mark. "Padre," he whispered. Not loud, just reverent. The priest smiled, lifted a hand in greeting. "Ciao, Marco." Marco practically leapt from behind the counter, nearly knocking over a cup in his haste. "Please sit. Anything you want. It's on the house." And honor to Luca stepped in behind, confusion creasing his brow. "You two know each other?" "He's visited before," Marco said, eyes not leaving the priest. "Many times." The priest approached the counter with the unhurried certainty of someone perfectly at home. "2 espressos, please, and charge me, I insist." Marco hesitated, a protest forming on his lips, then slowly nodded. "As you wish, Padre." They sat at a small table near the back, worn wooden chairs that had held generations of Romans through morning coffees and evening wines. Luca looked around, taking in the way every person in the tiny cafe seemed to watch his companion with quiet reverence. "All right, what's the story? You some kind of celebrity priest around here?" The priest just smiled, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic cup that Marco had placed before him with unusual care. "No, just a regular visitor." Luca leaned in, lowering his voice. You've definitely been here before. That guy looked like he'd seen a ghost. Marco's family runs this cafe. His father passed away last year. I came to pray with them." The priest sipped his espresso, eyes closing briefly in appreciation. "Not long after, his brother was in an accident. A bad one." Luca blinked, genuinely surprised. "You remember all that just like that?" "I remember people, not places." They sipped in silence for a moment. The espresso was stronger than Luca expected, bitter and perfect, the kind of coffee that reminded you why Italians pitied the rest of the world. The priest rose quietly and walked over to the counter. "Marco," he said gently, "can I also pay for those gentlemen's lunch?" He nodded toward the card players, whose weathered hands moved, playing pieces with the certainty of decades of practice. Marco glanced at them, then back at the priest. They'd never accept it. Too proud. Then don't tell them. Just say it's from someone who was grateful for their laughter. Marco's face softened, something like recognition passing between them. "I'll make it happen." Luca watched the whole exchange, with narrowed eyes. Something didn't add up. This wasn't just a priest. This was something else. Someone else. Back in the car, he couldn't help himself. "You do that kind of thing everywhere you go?" The priest shrugged, the gesture containing neither pride nor false modesty. "Kindness isn't a strategy, it's a habit." "Like smoking?" Luca asked, half joking. "More like breathing," the priest replied. "When you stop, other things stop too." The answer wasn't what Luca expected. He studied his passenger more carefully now, noticing details he'd missed before. The way his hands rested in his lap, relaxed but ready, like someone accustomed to being called into action at any moment. The slight calluses visible on his palms, not the soft, pampered hands of someone who merely preached about work. The lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, suggesting those smiles were frequent and genuine. Luca fired up the engine, but his eyes kept drifting to the rear view. "Okay, but let me guess, you're some archbishop or something, right? Don't tell me you're just a parish priest walking around without a phone and handing out coffee to strangers." The priest gave him a look that wasn't smug, wasn't amused, wasn't defensive, just present, like he was actually considering the question rather than deflecting it. "Does it matter?" Luca didn't answer. Not because he didn't have one, but because for the first time that morning he wasn't sure. The rain had thinned into a mist by the time the taxi neared Vatican City. The ancient walls rose like quiet sentinels, their stones damp but unmoved. By centuries of weather and witness, Luca steered the cab into a quieter side street, pulling up near a discreet gated entrance guarded by two plainclothes security officers who stood straighter as the vehicle approached. "Here?" he asked, surprised. "This isn't the main gate." "It's where I'm expected," the priest replied softly. Luca twisted around in his seat, suspicion finally crystallizing into understanding. "What exactly is this place?" The priest didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door, stepped out slowly, and reached into his satchel. For a moment, Luca thought he might be reaching for cash. A tip, perhaps, for the man who'd spent the morning criticizing his entire institution. Instead, he pulled out a small envelope, simple and white. He leaned down through the open window and handed it to Luca. "For your daughter," he said. Luca's breath hitched in his throat. "Wait. How do you—" "I overheard you mention her earlier. The piano lessons." Luca froze. He'd said that in passing to the barista while waiting for the coffee, something about struggling to afford her classes these days, just a throwaway comment between strangers. "I can't accept this," Luca said, immediately trying to hand it. Back pride and confusion battling across his features. The priest didn't move. "Then don't accept it for yourself. Accept it for her." Before Luca could protest again, one of the guards stepped forward, recognized the priest instantly, and offered a formal nod. Your Holiness. Luca blinked. Wait. What did he just... The other guard opened the gate. Welcome back, Pope Francis. Time seemed to freeze. The white noise of the city faded. The drizzle suspended. Even the air felt suddenly still. Luca's mind raced through the morning's conversation. Every dismissive comment, every criticism, every casual complaint about the church, with the horrifying clarity of someone watching their own embarrassment in slow motion. Images from television and newspapers flashed before him, making the impossible connection between the humble passenger in his back seat and the leader of over 1 billion Catholics worldwide. The rosary comments, the criticism of wealth, the mockery about cars and phones, all of it directed at the Pope himself. His mouth went dry, his palms began to sweat against the steering wheel. The moment stretched like taffy, painfully elastic. The priest, Francis, turned to Luca and smiled gently. Thank you for the ride and the conversation. No judgment in those words, no hidden rebuke, just gratitude, genuine as sunrise. Luca stared, jaw slack, heart racing like he'd just slammed on brakes to avoid collision. But why didn't you say anything? Why, me? Francis looked at him with a kindness so steady it felt like a hand placed softly on the chest. Because people only truly speak when they believe no one important is listening. Then he turned and walked through the gate, the guards falling in quietly behind him. Luca sat frozen, the envelope still in his hand, the rain starting to gather again on the windshield. He didn't move until the gate had fully shut and Francis disappeared from view. Only then did he look inside the envelope. It wasn't money, it was a handwritten note. Let her music be her sanctuary. The world needs more beauty born of love. Below it, a folded voucher for 6 months of private lessons. Already. Then paid in full. Luca exhaled hard, pressing his palm to his eyes. The steering wheel cool against his forehead as he leaned forward. He had spent the entire ride mocking a man who turned out to be the most powerful, spiritual figure on earth. And yet, he hadn't been made to feel small. Not once. Luca didn't drive. Again, for nearly an hour, he just sat there, engine off, staring through the drizzle at the quiet stone walls of the Vatican. In a city that usually roared with scooters, vendors, and tourists, this corner of Rome felt suspended in time. He replayed the conversation in his mind. Every question he'd asked, every sarcastic comment, every word he now regretted. But what struck him most wasn't the embarrassment, it was the gentleness. Francis hadn't corrected him, hadn't flaunted who he was, he had just listened. Luca finally turned the key and pulled away from the curb. Back on the road, the city seemed different somehow. Not quieter exactly, but more vivid. The yelling fruit vendor on the corner, his hands stained with juice and life. The little boy in oversized school clothes running ahead of his mother, shoelaces trailing like questions. The old man feeding pigeons near the Pantheon. They all felt like they mattered more somehow. At the next red light, he glanced again at the envelope. On the passenger seat, it still felt heavier than it should. He reached for the radio, then stopped. For once, the silence didn't bother him. As his next fare climbed in, an American tourist barking into her phone about dinner reservations, Luca greeted her with a smile instead of his usual grunt. "Where to?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She barely acknowledged him. "Just drive, I'll tell you when to stop," Luca nodded. "Of course." As they pulled into traffic, he found himself checking the rearview mirror, not to glare but out of habit, noticing, being present. The woman continued talking loudly, complaining about the rain, the food, the crowds. Luca didn't interrupt. He just drove. After a while, she paused and sighed. "You ever get sick of all this noise?" He glanced up, catching her eyes in the mirror. "Sometimes," he said, "but every once in a while someone reminds you how to hear what really matters." She blinked at his reflection, caught off guard by the answer. "Who told you that?" she asked. He smiled faintly. a man who didn't need a car to go anywhere that mattered. What would you have done in Luca's place? Would you have mocked a stranger for not owning a car, only to discover he was Pope Francis? And maybe more importantly, how often do we judge someone's worth by what they lack instead of who they really are? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story made you stop and think for even a moment, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon turned on so you never miss one of our daily uploads. If you know someone who measures others by their status, income, or possessions, share this video with them, not to shame them, but to remind them presence, humility, and kindness never need to be chauffeured in. You should see some of our other stories popping up on your screen right now. Tap 1 to keep watching. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, with another story inspired by the legacy of Pope Francis.